Thank you all. Did you get enough stretching? You can get up again while you need, as you need to. So, and I can only imagine you had a very stimulating talk with Dr. Betteridge, and I'm sure you could maybe use a little bit more of a break, but we'll just kind of keep charging along. Are you very tired?
No, I'm very talkative.
You're very talkative? That's good. That's good. I want to thank Dr. Nassar and Renee for coordinating my visit this morning, and as well as Lisa Dali. Thank you for your warm welcome, and welcome. I want to say hi to Dr. Betteridge as well. It's nice to be in good company. Are you kind of from all over the place? Yeah, cool. So as Dr. Nassar was telling you, my entry point into Morocco is actually through France. So I've been working on France for the last 20 years, and it was really after writing my first book on the issue of the closet in France, thinking about how French people think about the closet, trying to think about how queer French people of Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian descent thought about the closet. And in the first book that I wrote, Queer French, I was trying to understand how the closet in many ways is a Judeo-Christian narrative. It's about death and resurrection. It's about the death of the heterosexual self and the rising from the ashes, if you want to use the phoenix as a metaphor, the rising from the ashes, or being on the cross, or emerging from the fire to become a new self. Well, that doesn't necessarily work in France, first of all. Is this on an automatic pilot? Oh. Okay. So the closet's not necessarily a meaningful metaphor in France already, where we have a much stronger separation between church and state than we do in the United States, for example. Church and state have been separate in France since 1905. And what that means is that if you know much about French literature, God is dead. With the existential movement after World War II, thinking about the atrocities of World War II, if God really exists, how in the world did we end up here? And thinking about existentialism, our existence in relation to others, and taking action in relation to other people in society. So it became a much more secular narrative. And so French people talk about assuming a true identity. Je m'assume, to assume my role in society as a mother, as a father, as a good child, as a good daughter, as a good son. So assumer mon homosexualité, or assumer mon identité, to assume my identity. So the closet wasn't really something that the French talked about, which makes it even more interesting as we kind of turn toward North Africa. And so we're going to talk about coming out in Morocco. We're going to talk about coming out in terms of queer Maghrebi French speakers because of my own background coming into this topic. And when I first started asking LGBT citizens in France to think about drawing an image of how sexuality is organized in the city, right? Are some of you from urban spaces where you've seen queer gentrification, right? If you think about DC, if you think about Chicago, if you think about Montreal, you see that there's these urban spaces that have been gentrified largely by people who have capital, and queers having capital and not necessarily children. They've invested in those parts of the country or parts of urban space. And so I asked LGBT citizens to draw a picture of queer city for me. And some of the maps that I saw, what you often see is French people conceptualize Paris like a snail, right? It's just part of their imaginary. And so they'll draw something that kind of looks like a snail. They'll put the Seine, the river here. They'll put some of the parts of the Marais district, the first 4 districts of Paris, which are home to the Jewish community and to the LGBT community. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at these maps, but you can see that different people have different renditions of urban space and where they put themselves in urban space. And this is the one that, oh, we're still on autopilot. This is the one that perplexed me for a long time. This was one that was drawn by Samir, who was a young French citizen of North African descent. And if you go back to that slide, you'll see that the map, the center of LGBT space is absent. And he sees that he doesn't fit into that particular space. Why do you think, as a queer of color, they would not fit into that urban space? Yeah.
Because the gay white French people are racist.
The gay white French people are racist? Not all of them. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it. Other ways of thinking. Think about the colonial relationship too, because we're going to talk a lot about that in terms of when we look at Morocco, looking at writer Abdelataya. He kind of wants to unpack that colonial relationship.
Was being gay or identifying as gay ever assumed that you were selling yourself out to a Western identity?
Absolutely. Did you hear what she said? Selling yourself out to a Western identity, right? There are folks that think that feminism is a Western construct. The French even think that queer theory is an American perversion of globalization, when in fact queer theory is based on Michel Foucault, Simone de Beauvoir, et cetera, right? So there are lots of places outside of America and outside of France even that think that homosexuality doesn't exist, that it's something that's been imposed on our culture, and that you could argue to a certain degree that that's true. An LGBT identity is something that's particular to a historic moment related to the AIDS crisis and coming out of the closet after the AIDS crisis. I mean, you could tie it back to Stonewall and the riots of the 1960s and liberation, but a lot of that is a Western construct. I tend to subscribe to the idea that you don't necessarily have to call it a queer identity or a homosexual identity, but women have sex with women all over the world. Men have sex with men all over the world. Whether or not you want to talk about it is a different topic. How you want to conceptualize it is a different topic. And part of the reason he didn't see himself here was because he thought that, you know, he was already part of the empire. He didn't want to necessarily be recolonized by the racist white French, you know, queer body. We use that, you know, in scare quotes. Oh, okay. Do you want to? Sure. And you not only, so taking the map as kind of an erasure of queer of color in France, thinking about where do we place people from sub-Saharan Africa, but also in regards to this talk in terms of North African descent, where do we see them in the media in France? And oftentimes, if you go back and forth between these two slides, yeah, which is fine, you know, in the French news and in the French LGBT news that comes out, you see images like this of, you know, we now have a same-sex marriage of Dominique and Mohammed, but we never see a picture of Mohammed in the press. There's shame that's associated with this outing to family, right? There's shame within the North African family. Then there's also shame in terms of marrying a white person, right? And so oftentimes these couples or these configurations don't kind of surface in the media. When they do surface, and this is the focus on the hands, there's a notion of impossible citizenship. They're coming to France oftentimes for sexual asylum, or they're coming for education. They come for university, and then they stay and try to find work. And it's an impossible form of citizenship because they never, as LGBT folks in North Africa, they didn't quite fit into their family culture. As LGBT in France, they don't fit into typical French Judeo-Christian culture, right? And so other people, so there's a little bit of scholarship on impossible citizenship, and therefore there's no language to talk about that sense of belonging. Others have written about this in terms of the notion of cruel optimism. Have you heard of cruel optimism? Yeah. What's that all about? It's a similar notion related to migration and diaspora.
It's been a while since I heard it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Any others? So it's this idea of, you go to, we're going to look at Abdullah Taya as an author. Look at Abdullah, who grows up in small town Morocco. He dreams of Paris because of what he's seen in the movies from, the New Wave up through, up through today. One of his biggest stars is Isabelle Adjani. He loves Isabelle Adjani. He's seen her in all of these films. He knows he wants to get out of small town Morocco. He wants to go to Paris, and he wants to realize himself. He realizes when he gets there, though, that he's still caught in kind of a post-colonial bind in some ways. And so this sense of cruel optimism, kind of selling this dream, make America great again, right? But then it doesn't ever come to fruition. Cruel optimism, this idea that, we're looking toward the Mecca, we're looking toward Paris, it could be the manifest destiny of going west and finding your fortune. But it's in terms of immigrants, in terms of people who are part of a post-colonial situation, it doesn't ever come to complete fruition. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at. The stories that we do see in France of North African LGBT and French North African LGBT is that they've grown up on the outskirts of the city in the ghetto. They've grown up in the projects, and that by coming into Paris, coming into city center, coming out of the closet, showing the rainbow flag, that it's a sense of conversion narrative. It's that they've found the light and they're going to come into city center and be a full-fledged citizen. Well, that's not the story that I was looking to tell, and I was trying to find other ways of thinking about belonging that didn't rely on France and French civilization as the beacon of civilized life and all good things. And so what I ended up doing in my second book, Queer Maghrebi French, and I'll pass it around, is I wanted to do field work with men in France. And I chose not to do women in particular because other young female scholars were working on that. And I felt like that was their place to do that. And also in terms of field work, if you've ever done it yourself, you have to develop a sense of trust with the people that you're working with. You have to develop a sense of community with the people that you're working with. So each of the chapters that I've written about, Tufik is the first one. He's a performance artist and a photographer of Moroccan descent as well. He's from Morocco. And he plays with the veil and he plays with the high heels. And this is kind of his coming out story. And he says, I do photography. I'm not going to get married. I have political views. I wear the veil. I'm agnostic. I eat pork and drink alcohol. I've become militant. The curves of my lips rewrite Islam. That's his coming out story. He never goes home to his parents and says, Mom, Dad, I sleep with men. Mom, Dad, I'm gay. Mom, Dad, I have a boyfriend. He says, Mom, Dad, I'm now performing in Paris, and here is some of my artistic production. And it's about, here the emphasis is about language in terms of thinking about ways of expressing his transgression to his parents. They understand it within their own cultural context, but he never has to use the closet as a meaningful signifier to talk about those kinds of things, right? So you can keep going. The book is organized around 5 or 6 different male figures, Tufik being one of him. Tufik plays with various images from the veiled and pious Fatima and her husband Abdel to the French. He eventually moves to Montreal. He has a sense that he wants to leave France and move to Montreal in terms of thinking about liberation and democratic society. And he develops French-Canadian characters. He develops a character who's into hip hop. He develops a closeted Italian Moroccan character here, and he plays with his identity through his own photography. And he talks about his own identity through them as opposed to creating what we would call kind of a linear coming out story, okay? So that's kind of the notion of language, and here's an example through Tufik. If we look at another example, oh, and he also, I don't know if you know the well-known painting of Las Meninas. Las Meninas is the king and queen of Spain, and he's playing with the queen here and kind of this unveiling of Fatima. She eventually decides in Western society to drop the veil and to be kind of a feminist figure. And so he uses, and this is part of the point of the next hour, if you take something away from this, one of the meaningful points of departure for LGBT identities in Morocco and in North Africa, broadly defined, comes through feminism. And it's fascinating because it comes through the figure of the mother, and the mother as a sense of revolution. Mom was the first one to kind of break the mold, right? And to kind of push against patriarchy. And my point of reference in Morocco is not looking out and seeing kind of a LGBT community. It's, okay, what's in the family that I can reconstruct? And mom is a strong force of revolt and rebellion and inspiration. And so the female figure comes through a lot. The dropping of the veil comes through a lot as kind of the way to make meaning in North African families. Does that make sense? Okay. So then if we look at Ludovic Mohamed Zayed, Ludovic is actually the first gay imam in France, and probably the only vocal gay imam in France. He also has a PhD in the anthropology of religion from the University of Paris Sorbonne, and he wrote a book called The Quran and the Flesh, and it hasn't been translated yet, but if you can read French, you may be able to use this in some of your teaching. And I've got a bibliography here that I'll pass to you so that you can kind of maybe adopt some of this for your own classes. But in the book, he kind of talks about how feminist religious scholars and theologians were rereading the Quran and rereading the teachings of Muhammad in the Hadith. And he finds a way to kind of take and build on that feminist critique of the Quran and to kind of talk about a queer space within the house of Muhammad. And so when he talks to his family about his coming out, he talks about kind of this intersection of identities. He talks about being French, he talks about being Algerian, homosexual and Muslim. And then he uses these images from, and his family is from Algeria. He uses these images of going to Mecca, to pray, to go on pilgrimage. And the two signifiers that he uses throughout his writing is to come out of the harem and to come out of haram. And so instead of coming out of the closet, he uses the harem as a way of coming out of the house of the father, and haram coming out of the forbidden, I suppose, right? And that's the way he makes meaning in the way he talks to people in his local communities about his identity. And so the book is about language, temporalities, and transfiliations. So language we saw a little bit with Tufik, and we see it a little bit here. But we also think about temporalities in terms of space and time. And so where do we position ourselves in terms of, is this a linear chronology of I was in the closet and I'm now out of the closet? Or is it some sort of cyclical system? Is it something that's a familial system where there's a sense of production and reproduction of ideas within the family? And here you see, particular spaces, the harem and the haram, which are not significant for, at least for the French tales that I was looking at. Okay, thank you for kind of putting up with this. So one of the other chapters that I'm looking at is director Mehdi Ben Attia, who's from Tunisia. And this is a film you can use in your classes because it's subtitled. So, why don't I pass this around? Would you mind kind of sharing this with the class? Mehdi Ben Attia is from Tunisia, and he's done a lot of work on French TV. And this is one of his, I think this is his second long métrage, his second dramatic length movie, and it's called The String. And I don't know if you can kind of see from this screenshot here, but it's the story of a Tunisian guy who goes back to Tunisia after having been educated in France, and he talks to his mom about having fallen in love with someone. And each time he gets ready to tell his mother, all of a sudden this string kind of appears around his waist, and he ends up kind of twisted in this ball of string in his room by the middle of the film. And it's another type of metaphor that helps us understand the tie to family and the tie between mother and eldest male child, which is super important in terms of the obligation between mother and son, and that son belongs to mother, and that she will determine what he's going to become. And so when he comes back from France to Tunisia, he finds himself kind of anchored to the house. I won't spoil it for you, but it's a movie that I think you could probably use with your college students pretty well. It's beautifully shot, and there's a cool soundtrack. Your students would probably like it. And so when I had a chance to sit down with Mehdi, this is what Mehdi said about leaving Tunisia. He said, "I'm the eldest son of the eldest son of the eldest son." And I was like, "Whew, that's a lot of responsibility." And he's like, "Yeah." He said, "But I knew that as soon as I had my high school diploma in Tunisia, I was out of there. I was going to Paris. I was going to make movies. I was going to live my sexual life. I'm going to be fulfilled. I'll have time to do film there. I have to do it there." And so there's this, what we're getting at is kind of this narrative of not coming out of North Africa, but moving toward a space where I can talk about my sexuality and I can have a creative life where I can kind of realize who I am through my creative production. And I noticed that the title for this week was The Millennials Related to Literature, Culture, and Media. And I think this is a good example you could use in some of your work. I don't know if it's available on Netflix, but I think you could probably get it on Amazon Prime. Okay. And then the one that we're going to spend the rest of the hour working on is Abdallah Taya. Abdallah is a Moroccan author who grew up in a small town of Saleh. He was born in the 1970s, and he always knew that he wanted to write and he wanted to direct movies. His brother taught him, kind of exposed him to French literature. His father and he would sit around and watch old movies on television. And he knew that he wanted to tell his own story through writing and through cinema. And in his writing is about his body and his family's body quite a bit. And he says, I reveal myself by signing my real name. I reveal you with me. I come out of the shadows. And he talks about a sterile Moroccan ideal, this notion that Morocco continues to turn a blind eye to many issues related to women's rights, related to human rights, related to the individual and being able to realize his, her, or their dreams. Refusing this sterile Moroccan ideal. And then he weaves together, and this is where transfiliation comes in, he weaves together a narrative about both his inspiration from French literature, but also from Egyptian, Lebanese, Indian, and American cinema and their stars and their directors and their music. And he draws a lot on Jean Genet. I don't know if you've ever read Jean Genet's work. Genet is probably one of the most known, he wouldn't call himself LGBT, but kind of a queer writer from the 1940s and 50s in France. And so he weaves his own story to tales from French queer literature, but also to images of Marilyn Monroe. And he's fascinated. He and his mother were both fascinated with Marilyn Monroe. And so when you think about LGBT issues, and I don't know if Dr. Bettridge had kind of evoked this in her talk earlier, but even when you talk about feminism, I mean, you're talking about global movements, and you can't talk about one part of the world in isolation from the rest of the world. And so when we're talking about LGBT issues in Morocco, we're really talking about global movements, okay? Let's kind of stop there for a second. You have questions, reactions? Yeah, go ahead.
What I think is interesting too is
Mhm.
that not only are French academics very distrustful of they don't trust really this notion of queer theory as it's coming out of U.S. academia, but also post-queer theory.
Yeah.
Right. So they have this. You're thinking that it's also kind of this recolonization in terms of academic speak, and that the one text is part of the last, right, of what this point is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting having my dad's family was from outside of Montreal, Canada. And so my own roots are in Quebec. And I've spent most of my life working on France. And so when you go to the French bookstore in France and look for women's studies, let alone LGBT studies, people are like, what's that? Oh. Still, it's 2019. Still, right? And the same thing with post-colonial theory. There's a shame that's associated with it. They don't want to talk about it. You go into Montreal and you look for women's theory, queer theory, you look at post-colonial studies, you look at indigenous, First Nations in Quebec. That stuff is exploding. And it's because it's North America, right? There is a shame among, and today in the United States even, I mean, as a scholar of French LGBT studies, I've never gotten a job because of my research, because I don't work on literature. So I ended up kind of moving up the food chain over time through administration, coming here to the U of A because of becoming department head. It was never because there was value associated with studying sexuality in French studies. Yeah. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, though, even if it's not explicit, like gender, sexuality, indigenous, and colonial theory, are some of the concepts still like
in the scholarship?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
Or
it
people like are doing that.
Well, so Abdallah being a novelist, he's publishing in Paris. He's writing in French for a mostly French audience, right? It's taken a long time for him to get traction and to get a public, but since he's won a couple, if you look at the bibliography, yeah. Once novelists start to win prizes, they gain some traction, and luckily he's done that. We're going to look in this second kind of iteration. We're going to look at a couple of scenes from his film Salvation Army, which was based off from his novel of the same name. But there are also, success comes through lots of heartache as well, because you'll see that the way that Abdallah gets from small town Morocco to first to Geneva to do his master's degree and then to Paris to do his doctorate, there's a lot of price that's paid for that, right? Look at each of us as academics. What price is paid to kind of pick up and move to some bizarre part of the country where right? What do you leave behind by doing that? Imagine what international scholars do by doing that, right? What do you leave in the kind of the wreckage behind, right? And that stuff comes out in the writing, and you'll see a scene in particular this morning where there's symbolic violence and there's physical violence associated with that. You're excited. That's good.
My group is going to be presenting an excerpt from Olivier Bois' material, and I just saw the section here where he used the word terrorist and a queer in one sentence. So I was wondering, especially with what you just said about the symbolic violence and the wreckage that can be left behind, how is he framing the word terrorist in his material? Like, is he talking in relation to Moroccan society or French from being a person from the place that French people don't want to remember the shame behind.
Do you want to save that question for the end?
Yes.
Because I don't want to. There's some cool images here that we'll look at. But the point is that growing up in small town Morocco, figuring out that he's same-sex identified, he's going to continue to work with the local context, the local meaning making, the local signifiers. I spend a lot of time. I'm a semiotician at heart through Roland Barthes' work, but he's going to use that context to then make meaning in relationship to his mom. He's going to make it in relationship to his aunts, his strong female figures in his life. But he's going to move from victim, right? Victim of homophobic local context, post-colonial shame. And he's going to move from kind of, there's also a history in North Africa of the European coming in as the sexual tourists to sleep their way through North Africa, and then to bring those stories back to France. He's going to play with those. And at some point, he'll take the figure of the terrorist and he'll use that to kind of reset what it means to be revolutionary in LGBT culture. And if you're familiar with some of the LGBT theory, like the book by Puar on terrorist assemblages, homo nationalism, in that book, there's this notion that the West has co-opted the good LGBT citizen in defense with the US flag of all things that are not from the West, including, violence against women, violence against LGBT individuals, and that's a bad thing. Well, what Abdallah and what others are doing on the ground is they're taking those they're identifying as same-sex desiring, but then they're using those images like the terrorist to kind of turn it on its head and say, we're here too, and we're co-opting, we're taking this image back, and we're going to use it in ways that is not kind of detrimental or hurtful to local culture. Okay. So let's look at, this is a film, Salvation Army, L'Armée du Salut, that you can use with your students. And it's about an hour and 20 minutes. Is it a masterpiece? No, but it gives you kind of, if you want kind of some real material from a Moroccan director on his experience growing up as gay in small town Morocco, this is a good place to start in terms of, it kind of gives you, it's kind of an ethnography, it's a kind of a case study. Okay, so we're going to look at, because of time, we're going to look at just a couple of clips. So in this movie, the gist is that Abdallah eventually learns French. He's fascinated with his brother who can read French. He eventually decides he wants to leave Morocco, and he finds he falls in love with a Frenchman who comes to Morocco and creates an opportunity for Abdallah to come to Geneva and to study, to do his master's in French. It's highly autobiographic. And then eventually, if you were to read the follow-up, the Arab Melancholia, you would see what happens in subsequent parts of his life where he moves to Paris, okay? So we're gonna look at two clips. The first one is actually about 43 minutes in. It's a scene where he and his brother, Slimane, so it's Abdallah, his older brother Slimane, and then there's a kid brother as well. There's three brothers on vacation in Tangiers at the beach. And Abdallah sees his brother reading a book written in French, and he kind of rejects it. He's fascinated with his older brother because he's the eldest brother and everybody in the family reveres him. But at the same time, he's not sure about the French. And so this kind of tells us a little bit about his relationship with the French language and eventually with French culture. sure subtitles are on. That's his brother Sliman. They go on vacation to Tangiers, and the mother is afraid that her eldest son, Sliman, will find a prostitute. And so she asks Abdallah to watch out for the oldest brother and to slip a talisman underneath his bed to kind of keep him protected. And so it's Abdallah who's got to watch out for his older brother, who's kind of in the midst of his own sexual discovery. But then after this, they move to the beach. This is the scene I want you to see.
علاش كتقرا بالفرنساوي؟
Tu n'aimes pas le français? Tu as compris ce que je t'ai dit? Réponds. Tu n'aimes vraiment pas cette langue?
هضر معايا بالعربي.
Pourquoi? Tu n'aimes vraiment pas français, Yak?
شنو غادي ندير بالفرنساوي؟
Qu'est-ce que tu veux dire par là? ما فهمتكش.
الفرنساوي هي اللغة ديال الأغنياء في هاد البلاد، ما خاصكش تهضر بها.
Tu changeras d'avis, tu verras. J'en suis sûr. Il n'y a pas de mal à parler français. Ça pourra t'aider à réussir. Tu veux rester au Maroc? Passer toute ta vie ici?
أنا معاك. علاش نخرج من البلاد؟ نمشي فين؟
Je vais aller nager.
So he learns early on that French is going to be a vehicle. It's a vehicle for his brother. It's a vehicle for him. Okay. Let's look also a little bit later on at the moment where he meets the Frenchman. Let's see where we are.
المهم دير لها داك شي صفر اخر شي صفر اخر
No, the talisman didn't work.
زعما
10 years later. So we end that beach scene where he's lost his brother. It's kind of his first kind of romantic breakup with his brother because he revered him so much. And then this is the Frenchman
Le thé est
Jean.
servi, monsieur. Merci. Vous désirez autre chose, monsieur? Non. Tenez.
Merci monsieur, à votre service. Bonne journée. Merci beaucoup.
Abdallah, le thé à la menthe est prêt, tu viens? Rejoins-moi sur le balcon. Abdallah, le thé va refroidir, tu viens?
It's Casablanca, maybe?
Une flouka! Vous voulez une flouka? Viens! صاحبك هذا ما تخافش ترونكيل هو اللي كيفورني عليك ياك
اسكندريه بدنا
Azmour, monsieur. Il était beau. Beau, hein?
Ah oui, c'est très beau. Et la plage est par là, c'est ça?
Et la plage là-bas. Là-bas. Et le grand bateau sur le sable.
De quoi il parle?
Il y a un grand bateau échoué là-bas, il dirait.
On le verra?
Oui, si tu veux.
Ah oui, je veux voir ce bateau. Tu m'emmènes?
Oui, d'accord.
صاحبك لاباس عليه؟
سويسري.
سويسري. زارة.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle dit?
Vous voulez savoir de quel pays tu es?
Oui, je suis suisse, de Genève. Et toi? Tu es d'ici, de Zemmour?
Oui, je suis d'Azmour. Je suis un vrai Zmouri. ماني عارف يدرم الطويله راه ما قلتهاش خصك تزيد في الثمن شويه خصك تفورني على خوك فهمتيني
شحال بغيتي؟
تريد ما كايناش المتاوي شوف حنا في الخلا فهمتيني الخاوه
فهمت.
دابا عجبتيني والله تعجبتيني بالله تا هو راك عاجبك باين فهمنا فهمني
شكرا. Abdallah! Abdallah!
And then just one more scene, because I think we have time. This is where he gets to Geneva. He arrives a month early. He can't get his scholarship yet. And the professor sends him away. Don't do this to your student, okay? We don't quite understand, the film is a little bit different from the novel. Somehow there's been a breakup with Jean, with all of this kind of tension between them. But there's kind of this explosive scene at the end of the film here, where you can kind of see, we get back to the notion of cruel optimism. What did you kind of give up to come here, right? And he's going to Jean accuses him of a couple of things, and he says, "Yep, you're absolutely right." So he takes some really negative stereotypes of what it means to be a kid who kind of found his way to Europe through his sugar daddy, and he kind of turns them on their head. I'll show you.
Je sais pas où aller. J'avais pensé que la direction de l'université pouvait m'aider à obtenir la bourse plus rapidement. Enfin, en avance, je veux dire.
La bourse de la Confédération?
Oui.
Ah mais c'est impossible, vous ne pouvez toucher votre bourse qu'à partir du 1er novembre, c'est la règle.
Mais comment je fais, moi, maintenant? Je suis ici, madame. Je sais pas où aller, je sais pas où dormir.
Écoutez, je suis désolée monsieur, mais c'est pas mon problème. La règle, c'est la règle pour tout le monde. Revenez me voir dans un mois.
Qu'est-ce que tu fais ici, à l'université? T'es à Genève depuis quand? Tu dors où? À l'hôtel? Tu coupes toujours tes cheveux courts? C'est court. Très court. Mais j'aime. Beaucoup. Beaucoup. Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire maintenant?
On ne va rien faire. Je veux plus rien de toi.
Quoi? Répète ce que tu viens de dire. C'est pas ce que tu disais il y a encore 4 mois. Tu jouais encore à l'amoureux avec moi. Tu jouais parfaitement. C'est ça?
J'ai tout expliqué dans la lettre que je t'ai envoyée du Maroc. Je n'ai plus rien à dire.
Je me suis habitué à toi, moi. Comment je vais faire sans toi dans la vie?
Tu m'oublieras.
T'as pas de cœur. Je t'ai jamais empêché de faire quoi que ce soit. Bien au contraire, je t'ai toujours poussé. Poussé à progresser.
Mais je n'ai besoin de la bénédiction de personne.
Je comprends pas. Je comprends pas.
Moi non plus, je comprends pas.
Tu as changé. Qu'est-ce que je t'ai fait au juste? Dis-moi. Dis-moi.
C'est ce que je t'ai expliqué dans la lettre. M'oblige pas à tout répéter.
Pourquoi tu veux me fuir? Tout arrêter? Je suis devenu un monstre comme ça du jour au lendemain? Tu m'as utilisé. Depuis le début, t'as fait que ça. T'as tout calculé? T'as plus besoin de moi maintenant. Alors tu me jettes comme ça, sans état d'âme, c'est ça? C'est ça? Regarde ce que t'as fait de moi. Regarde. T'es qu'un arriviste. Voilà ce que t'es. T'es une pute. Une pute.
Décidément, tu ne veux vraiment pas m'entendre. Alors oui, je suis une pute. Une pute. Je suis un arriviste. C'est ça la vérité. Je t'ai utilisé. J'ai profité de toi. Et j'ai obtenu ce que je voulais. Une bourse. Un visa. J'ai quitté le Maroc. J'ai quitté ma famille. C'est ça ce que je voulais. Ce que je voulais. Et maintenant, je suis libre. Libre, tu m'entends? Libre. Libre du Maroc. Libre de toi. Libre de toi.
And we don't have, I wanted to kind of move into one more movement of the presentation, but we don't have time for that. But what I will do is I'm going to leave you with an excerpt of Infidels. This book has been translated. The excerpt the Infidels is about a prostitute mother and her son, and how they make a living wandering through Morocco and eventually out of Morocco into Egypt. And both of them admire Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn becomes this divine orphan that both of them esteem, and they each have their liberation story. One through the mother being feeding her family by being a sex worker, and the son as being kind of her sidekick who kind of supports her along the way. The narrative structure of the book, Infidèles, is actually the narrative structure of a 1950s American film called The River of No Return. The River of No Return was written in 1954. It was a story of I think it was filmed in Montana or something, but it's the story of a ranger who falls in love with a woman played by Marilyn Monroe, and the ranger has a son, and it's the three of them on a raft going down the river to catch a couple of thieves. And so the whole story is kind of an homage to Marilyn Monroe and what she represents for the mother and what she represents for Abdallah. And they both revere her as somebody who dies too young, who is an orphan of the state, who is an outsider, who is a revolutionary figure. And he writes this novel very much later in his career, after he's been in Paris for maybe 15 years. And part of the argument that I made about this novel in the book was that as the Moroccan author moves to Paris, he's writing a lot about European novelists like Jean Genet and others. When he spends 15 years in Paris, he's kind of over France and he wants to think about other icons that have affected him. And the book is replete with Middle Eastern names and characters and soundtracks that you'll find, which for me as a French professor, they're up here for me, they're over my head. But in terms of the references to Marilyn Monroe, the references to Alfred Hitchcock, the references to David Bowie, there are all kinds of kind of global images in here that he uses to kind of tell the story of the downtrodden, both the single mom and of her queer son. And at the very end of the tale, I don't want to spoil it for you, but at the end of the tale, he falls in love with a suicide bomber. And they don't sleep together, but there is an explosion. Now, the explosion happened, and they go into a movie house in Casablanca, and they blow up the movie house in their final act of love. And they end up at the gates of heaven to be welcomed by no other than not the 99 virgins, or the 70 some odd virgins, Marilyn Monroe. Yeah. So he takes the suicide bomber and he totally kind of, and he's basing it on some of the suicide bombing attacks from Casablanca from years prior. And there's now a whole group of, not a whole group, but there are some, I don't know if you know the movie director Nabil Ayouch. Ayouch did a film called The Horses of God, Les Chevaux de Dieu, and he chronicles this kind of move from not being radicalized to being radicalized. And within that cell of radical jihadis, there is kind of this play with same-sex desire. People are using that trope in very different ways and sometimes dangerous ways in the media. But in the literary texts and in the cinematic texts, they're being done sometimes in poetic ways that are trying to create new ways of thinking about revolution without reinforcing this clash of civilizations, the separation of the East and the West. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll pass these out. This is a scene where, and then we'll leave it at that. This is a scene where the prostitute mother and the son go to the hairdresser, and the mother is having an argument with the Egyptian hairdresser about who's her favorite Middle Eastern singer. And at the end, she says, I don't like any of them. And she goes, I don't like any of the actresses. I want you to dye my hair blonde like Marilyn Monroe. And so you see how Marilyn kind of influences this whole cultural production. Okay? All right.
With that, we're on time. Let's give Denis Provencher a round of applause.
Thanks, it was fun.